An entitled Karen snatched a medal from a Royal Guard's uniform, calling it nothing but a souvenir. But when he broke protocol and revealed its true meaning, she was left in tears. Here's what actually happened. Now, before we continue, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. And make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow at this very same time, we're dropping another powerful Royal Guard story that you won't want to miss. The afternoon sun bathed Buckingham Palace in a golden glow, casting long shadows across the immaculate courtyard where hundreds of tourists gathered. The scent of freshly cut grass mingled with the perfumes and colognes of visitors from across the globe, all eager to capture a piece of British heritage with their cameras. Children pointed excitedly at the majestic facade, while parents consulted guidebooks, their voices creating a gentle hum of anticipations beneath the clear summer sky. The palace stood as it had for centuries, immovable, dignified, a symbol of continuity in a rapidly changing world. Tourists from dozens of nations moved about with reverent excitement, their languages forming a global symphony of admiration for British tradition. Among the sea of faces stood Royal Guard Sergeant James Harrington, a statue of scarlet and black against the palace's imposing stonework. At 32, Harrington was no stranger to duty. His posture remained perfect, despite the 4 hours he'd already spent at his post, his eyes fixed forward with unwavering discipline. The medal pinned to his chest caught the sunlight with each subtle breath. Unlike the ceremonial accoutrements of his uniform, this medal told a personal story, one etched in sacrifice and courage on a distant battlefield. A commotion at the edge of the crowd drew momentary glances from nearby visitors. A woman's voice, sharp with entitlement, cut through the respectful murmurs. "Excuse me, priority access. Can't you people read signs? Move aside." Patricia Winters had arrived, and the atmosphere shifted perceptibly as she carved her path through the yielding tourists. Several visitors exchanged knowing looks as the woman pushed forward, her complaints growing louder with each step. Behind her trailed a teenage girl whose reddening face betrayed her mortification. The girl's apologies were barely audible beneath her mother's strident tones, her eyes fixed firmly on the ground as though hoping it might open and provide escape. Patricia swept into the palace courtyard as though she owned it, her crisp white linen pantsuit standing out starkly among the casual attire of other tourists. Her diamond tennis bracelet caught the sunlight with each imperious gesture, matching the cold sparkle in her eyes as she surveyed the scene with evident disappointment. Her hair, cut in a precise bob that framed her face in severe lines, didn't dare shift in the gentle breeze, a testament to both expensive product and an iron will. "Can you believe this place?" Patricia announced to no one in particular, her Connecticut accent carrying across the courtyard. "They charge you an arm and a leg for tours and then make you stand around like cattle." She checked her perfectly manicured nails before tapping her foot impatiently on the cobblestones. Her teenage daughter, Megan, hovered several feet behind, creating what little distance she could without losing sight of her mother completely. The girl's summer dress and sensible walking shoes marked her as the only member of the family who had researched appropriate attire for a day of London sightseeing. "Mum, please," Megan whispered. "Everyone's staring." "Let them stare," Patricia replied without lowering her voice. "Maybe they'll learn something about standing up for yourself." She pulled out her phone and began dialing. "This is ridiculous. I'm calling Bernard right now." A young British couple nearby exchanged glances as Patricia's voice grew louder. "Bernard? Yes, it's Patricia Winters. Listen, I need you to call whoever manages this tourist trap and tell them I'm here. No, they haven't prepared anything special. Yes, I specifically told your agency I expected VIP treatment. I'm a platinum member of the Continental Heritage Society back home. I've toured the White House private chambers for heaven's sake, and here they have me waiting in line like I bought my ticket from a discount website." Meghan had retreated further, pretending to be absorbed in reading a pamphlet about the palace history. A sympathetic tourist offered her a kind smile, which she returned with grateful embarrassment. "No, Bernard, that's not acceptable," Patricia continued, her free hand gesturing dramatically. "I serve on the board of the Lakeview Estates Homeowners Association. Do you have any idea how many dignitaries have been to my summer galas?" She paused, listening briefly before cutting in again. "Well, find someone who can help. That's what I'm paying you for, isn't it?" As she approached the front of the gathering, her eyes locked onto Sergeant Harrington standing at attention. Her lip curled slightly, the expression of someone who had just discovered an unexpected performance. "Well," she announced loudly, "at least they've provided some entertainment while we wait." Patricia positioned herself directly in front of Sergeant Harrington, studying him with the same critical eye she used for evaluating domestic help. "Megan, come look at this gentleman's outfit. This is what I mean about the British living in the past, all this pomp and circumstance, while the rest of the world moves forward." A middle-aged British man in a tweed jacket cleared his throat. "Madam, if I might suggest "Oh, I'm sure you're about to tell me the historical significance," Patricia cut him off with a dismissive wave. "I've done my research, thank you. These uniforms haven't changed since the Victorian era because the monarchy can't adapt to modern times." The British man's wife tugged at his sleeve, murmuring, "Don't bother, love. Some people are determined to be difficult." "I heard that," Patricia snapped. "I'll have you know, my ancestor was Lady Prudence Whitmore, who was practically royalty herself. I understand British heritage better than most Brits, I suspect." Megan, who had reluctantly joined her mother, winced. "Mum, I don't think that's right. In history class, we learned—" "Megan, please, who pays for your private school education?" Patricia straightened her pantsuit jacket. "Now, as I was explaining to these good people, the changing of the guard was originally designed as entertainment for the commoners. A bit like throwing scraps to dogs, if you ask me." A tour guide, leading a small group, paused nearby, his eyebrows rising in surprise at Patricia's improvised historical lecture. When he opened his mouth to correct her, Patricia fixed him with a glare that had cowed countless service workers. As Patricia continued her unauthorized tour, her attention suddenly fixed on the gleaming medal adorning Sergeant Harrington's chest. The Distinguished Service Cross caught the afternoon sun, its polished surface a stark contrast against the rich scarlet of his tunic. "Well, would you look at that?" she said, her voice taking on a knowing tone. "Megan, come see this medal. It's just like the one your grandfather kept in his desk drawer back home." She leaned forward, narrowing her eyes. "Though his was probably authentic, these ceremonial ones are just for show." A hush fell over the nearest group of tourists. An American couple exchanged uncomfortable glances, the husband shaking his head slightly as if to distance himself from his countrywoman's behaviour. "The thing about these military decorations," Patricia continued, adopting the tone of an expert addressing novices, "is that they hand them out like candy these days. My third cousin works at the Pentagon, and he says they've got warehouses full of them." She tapped her chin thoughtfully. "Of course, the real heroes don't need medals, but I suppose they're good for morale." Megan had reluctantly returned to her mother's side, her face a mask of mortification. "Mum, I really think we should move on. The Tower of London tour starts in an hour, and—" "Just a minute, dear. I'm giving you an educational moment here," Patricia addressed the gathering crowd with the confidence of a university lecturer. "Now, these guards aren't actual soldiers, not anymore. They're more like actors, playing a role for us tourists," she gestured toward Harrington. "The medals are props, part of the costume." An elderly man wearing a Royal Navy veteran's cap stepped forward slightly, his weathered face tightening with suppressed anger. Before he could speak, Patricia had already moved closer to Harrington, her voice dropping to a stage whisper that carried clearly to everyone nearby. "I'll let you all in on a little secret," she announced. "These medals, they're mass-produced in factories, probably in China now. It's all just theatre." Her hand rose, hovering near the Distinguished Service Cross. "I can prove it." The crowd's collective intake of breath coincided with Patricia's fingers closing around the medal on Harrington's chest. With a casual tug that betrayed surprising strength, she plucked it from his uniform. The small ripping sound of threads breaking seemed to echo across the suddenly silent courtyard. See? Patricia held the medal up to the light, turning it between her fingers like a trinket from a gift shop. Just costume jewellery, probably worth about £5 at a souvenir stand. She glanced at her daughter, who stood frozen in horror. This is what I mean about British pageantry, Meghan. All flash, no substance. With casual disregard, she tossed the medal to the ground. The metallic ping, as it struck the stone pathway, sent a visible shudder through the veterans in the crowd. But Patricia wasn't finished. With deliberate steps, she ground the medal beneath her heel, twisting her foot as though extinguishing a cigarette. "There," she said with satisfaction. "Now we all know the truth." She checked her watch, an expensive Swiss timepiece. "Goodness, is that the time? We need to get moving if we're going to make our afternoon tea reservation at Harrods." As she took several steps toward the exit, the sound that stopped her wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It was the simple, distinct sound of movement behind her. Leather soles shifting on stone, the subtle creak of a uniform that had been motionless for hours. Patricia turned back, her expression moving from annoyance to surprise as she realized the source of the sound. Sergeant Harrington had moved. The collective gasp of the crowd seemed to hang in the air as Sergeant Harrington broke his stance. His movement wasn't rushed or dramatic. It carried the deliberate precision of 8 years of military discipline. Each motion was measured, controlled, and somehow more powerful for its restraint. With parade ground precision, he executed a quarter turn, facing the spot where his medal lay on the stones. The bearskin cap cast a shadow across his features, but even in that shadow, the intensity of his eyes was unmistakable. He lowered himself to one knee, the movement so precise it seemed almost mechanical, yet filled with unmistakable purpose. Patricia stood frozen, her mouth slightly open, as though her brain couldn't process this deviation from the script she had written in her mind. The crowd had formed a perfect circle around the scene, tourists backing away to give space to whatever was unfolding before them. Parents pulled children closer, cameras lowered out of respect, and the previous buzz of conversation died completely. With white-gloved hands, Harrington gently lifted the Distinguished Service Cross from the ground. His touch was reverent, like a priest handling a sacred relic. He held it in his palm for a moment, examining it for damage, his expression revealing nothing, yet somehow conveying everything. The years of military discipline that had shaped him were evident in this moment, not just in the precision of his movements, but in the perfect control with which he contained what must have been a storm of emotion. His fingers, which had once carried wounded children to safety under enemy fire, now cradled the symbol of that sacrifice with the same careful attention. A smudge of dirt marred the medal's surface, where Patricia's heel had ground it against the stone. With methodical care, Harrington reached into a small pocket of his uniform and withdrew a pristine white handkerchief. The crowd watched in absolute silence as he began to clean the medal, his movements unhurried yet filled with unmistakable emotion. Each stroke of the cloth across the metal seemed to tell its own story. There was history in those movements, personal history etched in blood and sacrifice that no tourist could possibly understand. The sunlight caught the tears in a young child's eyes as she watched, somehow grasping the significance even if she couldn't articulate it. Harrington's face showed a flicker of emotion, not anger as many might have expected, but something deeper and more profound. A muscle worked in his jaw as he turned the medal over, inspecting it from all angles. His fingers trembled almost imperceptibly as they traced the contours of the decoration. Patricia shifted her weight, the click of her heel against stone sounding obscenely loud in the silence. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but a nearby tourist, an American man in his 60s, silenced her with nothing more than a glance. Harrington's inspection complete, he rose to his full height once more. The medal rested in his palm like a wounded bird he had rescued, For a long moment, he simply stood there, looking at it in silence. The crowd waited, collectively holding their breath, sensing that they were witnessing something few had ever seen, the human being behind the ceremonial uniform. When he finally spoke, his voice was neither loud nor confrontational. It carried the quiet authority of command, the tone of someone accustomed to being heard without needing to shout. Each word was precisely enunciated, cutting through the summer air with knife-like clarity. "This medal," he said, holding it up so the sunlight caught its surface, "is not a prop." "This medal," Sergeant Harrington continued, his voice steady, yet resonating with quiet intensity, "was awarded to me in Helmand Province, Afghanistan, September 12th, 2014. He turned the Distinguished Service Cross slowly in his hand, the afternoon light dancing across its surface. "It represents not just my actions on that day, but the sacrifice of men and women who never came home." The crowd remained motionless, captivated by the unexpected moment unfolding before them. Patricia stood rigidly, her face drained of colour, unable to retreat or respond. "Our mission began as a humanitarian effort," Harrington said, his eyes seeming to look beyond the palace grounds to a place only he could see. "A remote village needed evacuation before the seasonal floods. Children, elderly, the sick, all needed transport to higher ground." His thumb traced the edge of the medal, feeling a small dent that had been there long before Patricia's heel had met it. Intelligence said the area was clear. Intelligence was wrong. A muscle worked in Harrington's jaw, the only sign of emotion on his otherwise composed face. "We were halfway through the evacuation when the first shots came. 3 of our vehicles were hit before we could establish a defensive position." He paused, the weight of memory evident in the slight lowering of his shoulders. "Radio contact was lost. Reinforcements were at least 6 hours away. The villagers were caught in the crossfire. Women, children, elders who couldn't run." Harrington's voice remained level, but something in it had changed, becoming both softer and somehow more powerful. "My commanding officer made the call to continue the evacuation while fighting a defensive action. We had 23 wounded civilians and only 2 field medics." Patricia's daughter Megan had edged away from her mother, her eyes fixed on Harrington with growing understanding. Tears had begun to form, tracking silently down her cheeks. The distance between mother and daughter seemed to grow with each word Harrington spoke. Not just physical distance, but something deeper and more profound. For perhaps the first time, Megan was seeing beyond the comfortable bubble of privilege her mother had constructed around them. "When the second attack came, we lost both our medics." Harrington's gaze briefly met that of a former military nurse in the crowd, who nodded in silent recognition of what came next. Someone had to stay with the wounded, while the others completed the evacuation. "I had combat medical training. It was the obvious choice." 3 days, he said simply. 3 days in a partially collapsed school building, 23 wounded, limited supplies, and constant fire. His fingers closed around the medal. The youngest was a girl, perhaps 7 years old. Shrapnel had torn through her arm, but she never cried. She helped me tend to the others, translating when my Pashto failed me. On the 3rd day, the helicopters came. We'd managed to keep 18 alive. The mathematics of that statement, the 5 who hadn't survived, hung in the air unspoken. Evacuation under fire is never orderly. The wounded had to be moved quickly, prioritized, loaded, while under constant threat. Harrington's gaze returned to the present, focusing on the medal in his hand. My best friend, Lieutenant James Collins, was coordinating from the perimeter. As the last civilian was loaded, he spotted a shooter on the ridge above the landing zone. For the first time, genuine emotion broke through Harrington's composure. A flash of grief quickly mastered. He could have taken cover. Instead, he exposed himself to provide covering fire. Collins didn't make it home, Harrington said quietly. Neither did Corporal Reed, Specialist Martinez, or Private First Class Williams. This medal, He held it higher, its significance now unmistakable. Belongs as much to them as to me. He turned the medal over, revealing an inscription on the back. My family has served in the British military for 5 generations. My great-grandfather wore the uniform during World War I. My grandfather fought at Normandy. My father served in the Falklands. His voice took on a new depth. This medal connects me to them, to their sacrifice, to the understanding that some things are worth fighting for, worth dying for. Harrington looked directly at Patricia, his gaze neither accusing nor angry, but unflinching in its intensity. Every scratch on this medal tells a story. This dent? He indicated a small impression on the edge. Made when I had to dive for cover while carrying a child to safety. This smudge in the metal. Blood that never quite cleaned away. Mine or one of the villagers, I'll never know. So no, madam, he concluded, his voice quiet, but carrying to every corner of the now silent courtyard. This is not a souvenir. It is not a prop. It is not something manufactured for tourists' amusement. It is a piece of history, my comrades' history, my nation's history. And it deserves to be treated with respect. Patricia's first instinct was denial. A nervous laugh escaped her lips before she could stop it, the default reaction of someone whose worldview was crumbling but couldn't yet admit it. Well, she began, her voice lacking its earlier confidence. I'm sure it's all very dramatic when you put it that way, but... She faltered as her eyes met those of her daughter. Megan's face was streaked with tears, her expression a mixture of shame and revelation. Something in that look, the realization that her daughter was seeing her, truly seeing her, perhaps for the first time, struck Patricia more forcefully than any words could have. Patricia tried again, her perfectly manicured hand rising to her throat in a defensive gesture. The diamond tennis bracelet caught the light, suddenly seeming gaudy rather than elegant. You have to understand, I didn't know... Her voice trailed off as she noticed the crowd around her. Dozens of faces reflected emotions ranging from disgust to pity, but none offered the validation she had counted on throughout her life. Patricia's carefully constructed facade began to crumble visibly. Her shoulders, always held back in perfect posture, sagged slightly. The imperious tilt of her chin lowered. For perhaps the first time in years, she was seeing herself as others saw her, not as the important, connected woman who deserved special treatment, but as someone whose self-importance had led her to commit an act of stunning disrespect. The men you mentioned, she said, her voice barely audible, your friends who didn't come home. The reality of those lives, actual people, not characters in a story, seemed to hit her all at once. The enormity of what she had done, in casually desecrating a symbol of their sacrifice, settled on her like a physical weight. I didn't realize, Patricia continued, each word seeming to cost her something. In my family, we've never had anyone serve in the military. I've never known anyone who... She gestured helplessly toward the medal, unable to complete the thought. I didn't realize, Patricia repeated, her voice breaking slightly. A crack had formed in her polished veneer, and through it, something genuine was emerging. Confusion, remorse, the dawning horror of self-recognition. Her eyes, which had always regarded the world with entitlement, now held a question she had never needed to ask before. What have I done? Is there... Patricia swallowed hard, her throat constricting around the unfamiliar words. Is there any way I can make this right? Her voice broke on the last word, the carefully modulated Connecticut accent giving way to something raw and unguarded. Sergeant Harrington's expression remained unreadable, but something in his bearing suggested he had heard such questions before. In hospital rooms where survivors asked about friends who hadn't made it. In memorial services where parents sought meaning in their children's sacrifice. Patricia's composed appearance had completely disintegrated now, Tears streaked her carefully applied makeup, and her hand trembled as she reached out imploringly. "Please," she whispered, "I'm sorry. I didn't understand what it meant. I would never have—" Her voice failed her again, the magnitude of her actions finally sinking in completely. "I'm sorry," she repeated, the words emerging with difficulty, as though she'd rarely used them in her life. "What I did was unforgivable. A sob escaped her, surprising no one more than herself. "I didn't know. But that's no excuse." Sergeant Harrington regarded Patricia for a long moment, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts. Then, with the same military precision that marked his every movement, he turned away from her and back to his position. The Distinguished Service Cross remained in his white-gloved hand, its surface now clean of the dust and dirt from the courtyard stones. With deliberate care, he reattached the medal to his tunic, securing it in its rightful place over his heart. Each movement was a ritual. The threading of the pin, the adjustment of the ribbon, the gentle press to ensure it lay flat against the scarlet fabric. To the watching crowd, it seemed less like a man adjusting a decoration and more like a sacrament being performed. Once the medal was properly placed, Harrington resumed his ceremonial stance, his eyes fixed forward, looking past Patricia as though she had ceased to exist. "Please," Patricia stepped forward, her composure completely abandoned now. "I need to make this right somehow. I need you to know that I understand now, that I—" "Mom!" Megan's voice was quiet but firm as she finally approached her mother. "He's back on duty. He can't respond to you anymore. It's time for us to go." Patricia turned to her daughter, seeing her with new eyes, not as an extension of herself, but as a person whose quiet dignity had always been present, if unacknowledged. "But I need to apologize properly. I need to make him understand that I—" "Look at him, Mum," Megan said gently. "Really look. He's standing guard again. The ceremony, the tradition, it's continuing. That's what matters now, not your apology." 2 palace security officers had appeared at the edge of the crowd, their purposeful approach making their intentions clear. They moved with the efficiency of men who had handled similar situations before, though perhaps none quite like this. "Madam," the first officer said as they reached Patricia, "I'm going to have to ask you to come with us." Patricia nodded, offering no resistance. "Yes, of course." She looked back at Harrington one last time, his motionless form a stark contrast to the emotional turbulence she had unleashed. "I just want him to know." "He knows," the second officer said, not unkindly. "But some things can't be fixed with words. Some lines shouldn't be crossed." As the officers escorted Patricia toward the exit, Megan following close behind, the crowd began to disperse. Parents quietly explained to their children what they had witnessed. Couples held hands a little tighter. Veterans stood a little straighter. The incident was ending, but its impact lingered in the collective consciousness of everyone present. What would you have done in Patricia's position once you realized the magnitude of your mistake? Is an apology ever enough when we've disrespected something sacred to another person? These are questions worth reflecting on in our own lives, where moments of realization can transform how we see the world around us. If this story touched you, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who might appreciate its message. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories about respect, tradition, and the unexpected moments that teach us what truly matters. Don't forget to press the bell icon so you'll be notified when we return tomorrow at the same time with another brand new story. Have you ever had a moment of realization that changed how you viewed a tradition or symbol you'd previously dismissed? Or witnessed someone learning a powerful lesson about respect? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place, with another story that we hope will touch your heart just as deeply.